we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome you to our first Ralph Steadman retrospective presentation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. My name is Scott. I'm a librarian in Adult Services, and on behalf of our whole library team, I'd like to welcome you to our event tonight. We have Katherine Kelp-Stebbins, who's a professor of comics journalism, comics studies at the University of Oregon, and tonight she's going to address the question, what is comics journalism? Before I turn it over to Katherine, I just wanted to mention a few things we have coming up. Right now we're celebrating Fiesta Cultural in the city of Eugene, and a lot of that is made possible by from the Lane Arts Council and the library's team who then put on a lot of events this fall. So I just wanted to mention a couple of those while I have a captive audience. We're doing a series of food and culture events at the library, and on this Saturday we're going to do one on Puerto Rico cuisine. We're going to have some people from Puerto Rico come in and demonstrate some of their native foods and have samples, so if you're interested in that. That's happening this Saturday. We're working with the University of Oregon Common Reading Program, and we're going to host a lecture by Helena Veramontes on language as action, and that's next week. And that should be pretty interesting, and that's going to be on the second floor. And then on Saturday, October 26th, we have best-selling children's illustrator and author Yee Morales, and she's coming up from San Antonio. So that's going to be a great event. So if you're interested in that, we have a whole series of art, dance, music, cultural programs to celebrate our Latinx community. So grab one of these bookmarks when you have a chance. Check that out. It should be a lot of fun. I have a couple things in back. We have, again, this is our first presentation to support the Jordan Smithson Museum's Ralph Steadman retrospective. If you don't know about that, you can grab some of the literature in back or head over to the museum. It's a great retrospective. And so what we've done to support that is not only put on lectures here at the Eugene Public Library, but we have a reading list that you can view on our website, and I printed out a bunch of copies in back. So grab one of those if you're interested in reading more about Ralph Steadman. And I also printed out a list of all the public lectures and related programs we're doing as part of the Jordan Snitcher retrospective, and that's in back. We're going to have some great events coming up here at the library. There's wonderful things happening at the museum. So I'll encourage you also to grab one of these brochures that Debbie at the museum, hot off the press, and this will tell you more about the Steadman retrospective. So again, thanks for coming tonight, Katherine. I really appreciate you coming down. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And I'll turn it over to Katherine. Thank you.
By deeply thanking all of you for coming out here tonight. This very exciting talk. And I also want to acknowledge the Kalapuya tribal lands on which we currently are. I also have a caveat. This is a Prezi, so I hope you took your Dramamine before coming in here. And I also want to just mention that this is a sort of a bridge between exhibits. So right now, as Scott mentioned, the Ralph Steadman exhibit is going on at the Schnitzer, and I will talk a little bit about Steadman in this talk, but it's also looking forward to a dedicated comics journalism exhibit to be staged in the coming years. And so this is your chance to become curatorial policymakers. So as I talk, if there are things that really stand out to you, that move you, that make you mad, that make you sad, or if there are questions that you have, please register those and then bring them to me afterwards so we can think about what this exhibition is going to look like. So now, how many of you, before either reading about this or getting lost on your way somewhere better and now feeling kind of awkward and stuck here, had even heard the term comics journalism? So that's a lot of hands, considering that when I first started really developing my love for comics 30-something years ago, this talk would not have been possible in the form that it currently is. And now, in the intervening years, we have a lot more in terms of nonfiction comics. I would imagine a lot of people have heard of genres like graphic memoir, and that shouldn't be quite as weird as it is, but thinking about things like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, or Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, or Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. You might have even seen the musical when it was staged last year, or also Tipui's The Best We Could Do. But comics journalism is really its own genre at this point in time. And it's a specific one, and it's one that has a very specific connection to Eugene, because the man who really did develop the practice of contemporary comics journalism, and everyone who knows me knows I'm not one to wantonly give credit to a single white man, but he was a Eugene alum. He came here to UO. He got his journalism degree in 1981. And Joe Sacco really made comics journalism what it is today. First with his reporting from Palestine, and then going to Bosnia and reporting on the war in eastern Bosnia in Seferi Garajda, The Fixer, War's End, and then recently engaging in projects like he went around with former New York Times foreign correspondent Chris Hedges to document the most impoverished places in the nation in their book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. And so the way that Joe really developed this entire field, his journalistic art entails both slavish dedication to the visual components of testimony and documentation, as well as an ethical imperative. And this is something I'm going to return to throughout. But as Sacco asserts, quote, "I mean to signal to the reader that journalism is a process with seams and imperfections practiced by a human being." So to understand how this contemporary comics journalism came into existence, we might go, and some do, all the way back to thinking about things like Trajan's column, because of course, what is this but a documentation in images of events, right? This is a story that's being told in juxtaposed events in a way that is supposed to be accurate or semi-truthful. But if we want to see a more direct correlation, we can look at people like Jacques Callot, who in Les Commissaires de la Guerre in 1633 documented how the 30 Years' War came into Callot's home place of Lorraine. And he made 18 prints. He was a really innovative printmaker as a way to witness the sort of devastation and the horrors that were going on near to him. And so this, in many ways, is what we would see as a more direct correlate. And in fact, Callot's prints so inspired Francisco de Goya that Goya made his own series of prints, 82 of them, in Desastres de la Guerra. So these were made between 1810 and 1820, and they were documenting how the Napoleonic Army's invasion of Spain and how the atrocities being committed there were affecting people near Goya. And so in both cases, these aren't exactly what we would consider comics, right? There's no word balloons or thought bubbles. There's not even really panels and gutters, but there are certain through lines, like successive images that create a narrative sequence. And in the case of Goya, these are especially presented with text in a way that has a real resonance for comics journalism. And this is what I want us to just spend a moment thinking about. He utilizes text in conjunction with an image to create a new paradigm of witnessing. This says, one cannot look. And yet, as the viewer, not only can you do, you must. Just to read this word, you have already been implicated in the image that you see above you. And so yes, one cannot look, but who is it who cannot look? Is it those within the image, turned away, eyes closed, shrouded from their impending death? Is it you who does nothing when you see this? This ironic message, no se puede mirar, simultaneously says something and asks you to do the opposite. You must look. You must witness what it is that is being shown. Simultaneously, Goya made a point of also documenting his own witnessing practice. And this is something that is really, really important to current comics journalism. Goya specifically tells us when he saw it. I saw this, right? He implicates himself in the witnessing act and shows marks where he was in terms of the events that occurred. He saw that, and also this. And so what Goya does is really make this act of visual witnessing a part of this verbal-visual dynamic tension. So of other significant figures, and I won't go too far, there are many in the development of comics journalism, and we might also want to look at Gustave Doré, and this is because our colleague Fabienne Moore in the Romance Languages department at UO just wrote a really brilliant article talking about how Doré really furthered the evolution of the comic book in his Histoire de la Sainte Russe, which was published in 1854. This was specifically looking at horrors of the Crimean War. And in our colleague Fabienne Moore's terms, Doré really invented a new sequential graphic presentation of history to affect his public's reading practice and let that public grasp the absurdity of wars, the repetition of history, the grotesque of absolutism, and political doublespeak. So we're not just talking about people drawing things, we're talking about a form of reading that is being practiced through these image text documentation practices. Now around the same time, beginning in 1842, illustrated reporting began to develop. First in the Illustrated London News, and then in a number of other publications. This was right around the time that new binding procedures allowed for a bunch of broadsheets to be brought together in what would be either daily or weekly publications. So many of these magazines, like the Illustrated London News, were documentary and consisted of illustrated articles about the events of the days. But the growth of these documentary magazines was paralleled by the growth of story papers like Penny Dreadfuls and later humor magazines like Punch, Puck, and Judge. Been to the Steadman exhibition already, you know why one of those names is very important. So it's in the later versions of these sorts of humor magazines that we see the birth of what many would consider our contemporary version of comics. And I'm mentioning this not because I want to give an hour-long talk about the development of comics, but because I want to stress how interwoven comics and journalism have been since their inception. These are sharing the same material substrate of the paper, they're circulating in the same reading spaces and being sold in similar ways as well. So that even in the development of news as we know it, we find a parallel in the development of comics in publications like Ali Sloper. And although the invention of the box camera in 1889 meant that most dailies and weeklies started using photographs instead of illustrations, the relationship between comics and news did not dissipate. Richard Felton Outcolt's cartoons, which were originally included in the color supplement of Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, provided two things. The strip that many comics theorists claim is the first modern comic as we know it, as well as the inspiration for the term yellow journalism. So again, there's this sort of cross-pollination in terms of comics and journalism. The reason people say this is the first comic is because of this sort of use of panels and specifically the use of word balloons in a way that some feel is very different from previous forms of emanata or word use within comic strips. We can debate about that later. But the way that this ties into yellow journalism is that little Irish kid, Mickey Duggan, who happened to be yellow, apocryphally perhaps, due to a printer experimentation with yellow ink. And this was the main character in Outcolt's Hogan's Alley. Now, when Outcolt was hired away from Pulitzer's New York World to work for Hearst's New York Journal, Pulitzer hired someone else to draw the Yellow Kid, George Lux, which meant that there were competing versions of the Yellow Kid being published by the two primary New York papers at the same time. This resulted in the Battle of the Yellow Kids. And here we see Pulitzer and Hearst in all of their finery. For many critics, who already resented the decline in journalistic integrity at both the World and the Journal. This battle symbolized the demotion of accuracy and authenticity in favor of money and sensationalism. Thus, journalist Irwin Wardman nicknamed the type of journalism practiced by the papers yellow kid journalism, which was later shortened to just yellow journalism. Just as one can trace the early development of comics to the developing infrastructure of newspapers and journalistic practice, one can also see the way in which comics journalism reflects changes in the purpose of journalism itself. In particular, contemporary comics journalism is a byproduct of what became known in the mid-20th century as new journalism, which was defined by Tom Wolfe as the appropriation of literary techniques and motifs by non-fiction writers, with a particular focus on subjective, detail, and emotion-rich, long-form reporting, balanced by a common concern with social realism. Joe Sacco credits himself as a new journalist and specifically talks about the sensory atmosphere of new journalist Michael Herr's Vietnam War Chronicle Dispatches as an important prerequisite for Sacco's brand of immersive journalistic reporting. And these are some of the first images from the Fixer where you see Sacco arriving in Sarajevo. And when we think about new journalism, it's really setting the scene, right? Being more concerned with what is around than what is happening. You can definitely pick that out in Sacco's, like, you can't even see quite how detailed this cross-hatching is. It's detailed. It took a very long time for him to make this really ambient, rich sort of scene for this particular event. So what Wolfe described as the rich and involving atmosphere of new journalistic writing was further enriched by the first collaboration, among many, of artist Ralph Steadman and writer Hunter S. Thompson for the 1970 Scanlan Monthly's article, "The Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved." And again, there is a much nicer and cleaner version of this particular image over at the Schnitzer right now. It's not your eyes. You're fine. This is not an eye test. It's just fuzzy like that. But there is a beautiful version right down the street if you want to go see it. So if, as Gay Talese once said, new journalism seeks a larger truth than is possible through the mere compilation of verifiable fact, might we not acknowledge, in Steadman's depiction of the crowd in the Churchill Downs clubhouse, a larger truth beyond mere documentary verisimilitude? Such concerns as those embodied by Steadman's impressionistic visual reporting are indeed at the heart of comics journalism. As Sacco says, the first main objection to any notion of comics journalism is, can drawings aspire to objective truth, or aren't drawings by their very nature subjective? By taking this gonzo and new journalistic focus on creating reportage that was truthful both about events but also about the subjectivity inherent in all journalism, Sacco used his training as a journalist to compose graphic reportage that would take the image-text combination of Steadman and Thompson in an even more visually immersive direction. So this is the first page from Sacco's Palestine. And when I talk about the way that visual and verbal sort of immersion is happening here, I think it's very obvious in certain ways. But you have Sacco, who is here, not really wanting to be in Cairo, but as all of the narrative boxes, as well as all of the word balloons, as well as all of the images kind of weighing on and over him allow you to see there's a certain way in which he himself is detained. He's trapped at this moment in the story, waiting to cross the border. And meanwhile, the visual busyness of the page itself gives you a sense of the place, right? The traffic, the noise, everything that's going on around him is really depicted through the exact paneling of all of these things against this background in a way that's almost chaotic in terms of its execution. And Sacco, meanwhile, is himself trapped, immersed in the situation. Similarly, this is the first page of his work, Sefer Garajda, reporting on the UN safe zone Garajda, where they had just started to get supplies coming in after a Serbian blockade had cut off all supply routes. So in this first moment in the book, Sacco is celebrating with other Garajdans the arrival of a UN convoy bringing them supplies. And here, Nina is making and giving the pizza that she has made with these news supplies. So that's the event, right? That is the now, the news. But meanwhile, you can see, literally, the background of this event. While the words are drawing your eye to properly follow the action in the page, meanwhile, there's literally a background here. And in fact, Sacco has shown what was the case before this UN convoy arrived, that people in Garajda had to trek through ice and snow for hours, sometimes starving, sometimes freezing to death, and that in fact, Nina's father died making one such trek. All of that is the background, and yet it's given to you in this one moment, right? So much of this story is presented very quickly through Sacco's particular brand of verbal, visual comics development. So having shown you what Sacco really started to do that made contemporary comics journalism into something that is now this field with many, many practitioners, I will barely scratch the surface of the thousands of people we could be talking about and the thousands of stories that they have brought to us through comics journalism. But let's spend a little while just thinking about what are some of the drawbacks to comics journalism. So the first and most obvious, comics journalism is slow. It took Joe Sacco over 3 years to draw this book. So if you're at home eagerly waiting for the latest news out of Garajda, this was not your mode for getting this. In an age when we are so used to immediate updates and footage on our wrist or in our pocket, comics in no way corresponds with what Howard Rosenberg and Charles Feldman describe as the need to speed of the 24-hour news cycle. Although, it's possible that haste makes waste. In their critique of the current model of news, No Time to Think, Rosenberg and Feldman point to a number of errors committed by journalists working on the feed the beast model of 24-hour news journalism. As former CNN Executive Vice President of News Gathering Keith McAllister stated, it is absolutely true, and anyone who says otherwise is slinging BS, although he didn't say BS, but there are children here, that every mistake that's made in the news business is made because of speed. So we might think about how the rush to publish has sometimes led to errors, such as putting the faces of two innocent bystanders on the cover of a New York newspaper, creating a rabid manhunt in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing. Neither of these men were in any way guilty of anything except being in the wrong place when the camera caught their backs. So, while comics certainly cannot aspire to this certain kind of frenzied 24-hour news cycle, there are other issues with comics journalism. The second being its lack of objectivity. Unlike a mechanical aperture capturing photons, a comics journalist is necessarily imprinting their own subjectivity and physicality onto every panel of a report. It's clear that comics journalism can never purport to be objective in the ways we might wish some of our journalists truly were. Every panel reflects the hand and eye of the artist who created it. Even more, and more specific to the comics medium, is the way that style influences readability. So the same way that I used to stop reading any series as soon as Rob Liefeld started drawing it, and you can see why. It's just not my style. It's not what I go for. The style of certain comics journalists may prove a visual impediment to a reader who might otherwise be interested in a story. And so this is the front page of Cartoon Movement, which is a Dutch site for comics journalism. And you can see a number of the stories that have been reported and that they're offering. But you can also see just from this image the variety of styles there, right? There are really different types of artists working in comics journalism. And that doesn't mean that any of these stories is more or less important or meaningful or powerful than any of the others. But it is one thing about the lack of objectivity in comics journalism is that you might not click on something just because it's not pretty. It doesn't appeal to you visually. And so that's one way in which comics journalism is always going to suffer from the lack of objectivity. And finally, comics journalism will also suffer from the denigration of the medium. Even the name comics, which arose from its association with newsprint and political cartoons, contributes to what The Economist calls the naming problem. It's easy to expect something to be funny when it has the word comics in it, and that can make sources unfamiliar with the medium hesitant to talk about serious things. How are you going to get Iraqi prisoners to talk about the torture that they experienced, as Safwa does here, or to get Sarajevians to speak on genocide or other matters of torture and criminal action if you say, hey, I'm going to make comics about you? Okay, there's a mistranslation even in the name. And especially in the US, the fraught history of comics is full of specific denigrations of the medium. First, through the court of popular opinion, and then through the court of the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, as led by Estes Kefauver, which contributed to the cultural maligning of the medium in a way that directly affects its contents. And I'll only gloss this very quickly. These are terribly misguided children in Binghamton in 1948 who are getting rid of what today could be worth thousands of dollars. I just really did not think this thing all the way through. And they were trying to do it because there was a big moral panic about juvenile delinquency and about kids going in the wrong direction. And they thought that by burning these books, they would somehow expiate this evil that comics was bringing in. If you've been to Binghamton, and I have, you know that they failed, and this was the wrong way to go about it. But at the time, we certainly felt that this was something that would actually help. And once it made it all the way to the Senate subcommittee hearings, this is also, of course, during the Red Scare, it's McCarthyism, people were nervous. And so the comics industry, all the mainstream publishers, decided to adopt a code in order to self-police their content. The Comics Code Authority, established in 1954, dictated precisely what comics could and could not show. Fun things like werewolfism are prohibited. Also, none of those sexual abnormalities we were all looking forward to. But similarly, just think about how hard it would be to accurately depict or even document something like the Watergate hearings when you're hemmed in by the fact that government officials shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. How would you even begin to touch something like the Vietnam War when in every instance good shall triumph over evil and the criminal be punished for his misdeeds? So by ensuring that all comics were suitable for children, the Comics Code Authority also assured that comics produced under its guidance were often directed at children. And so then it's not very surprising that there are still a great number of people in this country who are skeptical about the efficacy of comics to tell a serious story in a way that is appropriate to the subject. Because of the Comics Code, comics in the US tended to become either rightly or wrongly at least associated with topics and stories that were appropriate for children, which is part of the reason that comics journalism and nonfiction comics in general really arose from the underground comics movement in the US. So Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which this is taken from, and Sacco's journalism are later products of the trend of black and white avant-garde comics production that was ultimately only possible thanks to precursors like famed underground comic artist R. Crumb. And as uncomfortable as it may be to imagine comics like this as being dependent upon comics like this from the Bible of Filth, the sort of suspicion of authority that informed Crumb's comics, as well as journalism like Thompson and Steadman's, functioned as a real cultural a priori to the concept of telling a meaningful adult nonfiction story through panels, word balloons, and gutters. And in fact, R. Crumb is himself a sort of proto-comics journalist, having first written about life in Harlem, and then having been sent by Harvey Kurtzman for Help magazine in 1964 to report back on the state of culture in Bulgaria, which he did in this thrilling expose all about what life in Bulgaria is like. So having looked at 3 reasons that you might not want your story of importance to be told in comics journalism, let's switch instead to think about some of the benefits. And these may look very familiar. Comics journalism is slow. In fact, Joe Sacco champions it as slow journalism. If you look at Sacco's work in particular, you will see that every single page has a date indicating the amount of time it takes him to draw each image in his graphic reportage. He also makes a point to return to his subjects more than once to ensure that his first impressions are accurate and not circumstantial. And importantly, I also want to stress this in terms of cost-benefit analysis. If you came here because you were interested in the hot new career opportunity of comics journalists, I will say you will be eating cans of beans for the rest of your existence. It is not a very profitable endeavor, and I don't really mean to discourage anyone, but the work is generally painstaking and time-consuming for very little money. That also means that the slowness of comics journalism operates in tandem with accuracy. Drawing a work of comics journalism is an investment that requires a journalist's belief in the importance as well as the truth behind their account. And so this is from Sarah Glidden's Rolling Blackouts, where she documents a group of journalists traveling through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, mostly talking to displaced persons. And by the time they come back, so much has changed in the region, this is her talking to one of the journalists, that it feels like it doesn't even matter anymore, right? This isn't news. All of the events have become completely different. The situation's changed. The U.S. has decided to take action in Syria. But as her friend says, it doesn't make what they did any less important. And so Glidden's example also dovetails with the idea that comics journalism lacks objectivity. Marjane Satrapi, the author of Persepolis, once said in an interview, "Nothing is more truthful than a drawing because it's an interpretation." The author of comics journalism is physically invested in the story in ways that make comics journalism necessarily subjective as well as accountable. Sacco, in his description of his process, writes, "By admitting that I am present at the scene, I mean to signal to the reader that journalism is a process and it is practiced by a human being." While Sacco states that he has no trouble with the idea of American journalists' holy of holies objectivity, he doesn't believe that a reporter actually approaches any important story without having any preconceived ideas whatsoever. And if we think about that, why would you even go if you didn't believe that something was worth reporting on? In Sacco's view, journalism should not be a pure science, but rather an ethical activity. In this way, comics journalism is very much a product of new journalism and the shift away from objectivity and toward a sense of accuracy and truth that are necessarily limbed by the reporter, by their access, by their ideologies, by their languages, and by their backgrounds. A great number of comics journalists, we've just seen Glidden, now Sacco, here's Andy Warner, also include themselves in their accounts as an added form of accuracy and accountability. These insertions give the reader direct access to the constraints or motivations of a particular account in a way that is eschewed by the majority of news outlets. So this is from Andy Warner's The Man Who Built Beirut. It's his reporting on being in Beirut during the assassination of Rafiq Hariri and his attempt to make sense of what is going on. And as you can see, he doesn't quite understand what is going on. If you can imagine one of your nightly news reporters showing up and just saying, I don't know, it's really confusing. I'm gonna go have to do some more journalism to actually understand. You can see the importance of actually being able to do something like this, where you confess and admit how you as the reporter are constrained at the scene. Comics journalism is thus continually a genre that, in the words of Judith Butler, frames the frames of reality as it is represented through media. It is explicit about what journalism does and does not include and how. Here you can see Sacco critiquing the 24-hour news cycle, the way that reporters would come in to Bosnia and specifically Croatia, hit the same targets, make the same interviews, and be out within an afternoon. And here you see him also critiquing the way that certain scenes are manufactured, right, if they don't occur in time. Similarly, Sarah Glidden describes her approach in Rolling Blackouts as reporting on the reporters. And as she says, ethical media consumption includes understanding how the news is reported. It's easy to let information wash over you and not think about the people who shaped the story, but she would rather remind us that there's a lot of trust that goes into journalism, since data can be manipulated, context can be misconstrued, and the facts that a reporter chooses to omit or include can radically alter perceptions of different events. And so finally, the last benefit is, again, a familiar one, which is the denigration of the medium. Because comics are a frequently denigrated medium, because comics artists don't have a lot of money nor a lot of access, they allow for a far more democratic approach to telling stories. Both the journalists recounting the tale and their subjects represent perspectives that are non-hegemonic and rarely represented or given access to the information streams in mainstream journalism. So this is from one of the many investigative journalist pieces made by Dan Archer, who you can see drawing himself right here. And he went to specifically look at human trafficking in Nepal. And what Archer says about his process is that comics journalism is really about giving people who don't usually have an outlet to speak the ability to have their voices heard. Often, those who are most marginalized, be they trafficking survivors, undocumented immigrants, or homeless, are the least willing to have their face put on camera, understandably. By sketching them, I'm able to create more of a connection and show them the way that they will be represented on the page. The act of sketching helps to create a rapport with the interviewee, helping both me and the subject to lower our guard and to talk more openly as we watch the picture come together. The same goes for the devices and techniques of visual storytelling. As opposed to video or photojournalism, comics journalists are able to give the reader a first-person perspective by putting them in their shoes on the events that they are reporting. This is especially important for Archer in the context of human trafficking, where all too often the survivors are shown as the third-person other, typically young girls with their eyes blacked out or shown through grainy night vision photography. As he says, I wanted them to present their experience without resorting to those visual cliches. The democratization of comics is often reflected in the very titles of the projects that comics journalists take on. This is Victoria Lamosko's recent Other Russias, which is her attempt to document the people and places that are rarely seen coming out against Putin policies and other sorts of governmental practices that are occurring. And she goes and interviews all sorts of dissenting voices that I think are rarely seen in the media. Similarly, Sacco's The Unwanted, which I mentioned, is a multi-part piece in which he returned to his birthplace in Malta to interview African refugees and document their experience in the country and in the migrant camps in which many were interred. Jeroen Janssen's People Still Live Here, Signs of Life in Duel, is his attempt to depict life in this small town, Duel, in Belgium, where they're planning to raise the entire town in order to build this large seaport. So it's not just that these are people who don't often get heard, they're people who don't really, in the outlying areas, want, or people around them don't want them to be heard. And yet Janssen's whole idea is that it's the ethical imperative to go out and find them and tell their stories before this entire town is raised. Similarly, in Dan Archer's America Forgot About Us, he specifically goes through and interviews community members in Baltimore, retracing Freddie Gray's final moments before he was fatally taken into police custody. So in addition to telling these more democratic stories, comics journalism can also make certain events, certain levels of violence, more approachable by readers who might otherwise be averse to these topics. Daryl Holiday, who covers crime in Chicago, worked with the artist Ian Rodriguez to report the story of Natasha Stingley, whose daughter Marissa was murdered in 2013. As Holiday says of the use of comics journalism, I've written a whole lot of crime stories, you know. People would usually give it like 20 seconds to scan it, but packaging it up with comics, and it's like you've never heard it before. The same people will read the story all the way to the end. It can become a bridge. Similarly, Julie Gaffar and Andy Warner, in one of their pieces, documented a nighttime operation in the Mediterranean Sea by Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, to save migrants from a capsized boat. Many of these migrants were already dead, and yet the way that Gaffar specifically depicts them at once humanizes them without desensitizing you as a viewer to the tragedy that has occurred. Meanwhile, Rolling Blackouts, which we've talked about, specifically is a way for Glidden to present peoples and situations that might otherwise be really horrifying to try and think about or ever express. Glidden says, I think sometimes people feel desensitized to these stories about war and hardship. I think that comics can make people look again, because right now, nonfiction comics are still relatively new, and hand-drawn images and hand-painted images might make someone take a second look. And once they're there, I hope that comics can give someone an intimate connection to an issue that might be more difficult when there's a mechanical layer between them and the story, as with prose or photographs. And it is still an important means to document different types of violence, sometimes by the state. This is the work of Jesus Cosio, who's a Peruvian comics journalist. He has two books, Rupai, which is Historias Prácticas sobre la Violencia Política. His first book looks at political violence in Peru from 1980 to 1984. And then his second book, which was really a big deal, Barbari, specifically looks at political violence from 1985 to 1990, and he's now working on the next one in this series to continue doing this work. So in Cosio's work, you can see violence. It's not as if it elides the frames, and yet it also offers it to us in a way that doesn't immediately make it completely unpalatable. You can look, and you must. So beyond telling these sorts of stories that readers might not always be into, comics also uses space and scale in order to render incalculably large processes like climate change in visually engaging ways. So here's comics journalist Susie Kagels. This is a bit of her reporting on droughts in California. And this is from Josh Neufield's AD New Orleans after the deluge, where he went and documented the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, looking both at people and talking to them and getting their stories, and also looking at the huge scale of catastrophe as it unfolded. And then also, because it is a visual medium that can also do things that a camera can't and go places that a camera can't, comics journalism can certainly offer a platform to express stories that cannot be shown in any other way. So when Finnish co-authors, artist Emmi Nieminen and journalist Johanna Viku wrote their book, and I'm very sorry about this, Vihania Inhon Internet, or The Internet of Hate and Loathing, they used comics to make the experiences that they were reporting on, which was cyberbullying and online misogyny, visually resonant in ways that are more emotionally compelling than transcriptions of SMS messages. So they went around and interviewed various people who would have these horrifying experiences with being cyberbullied, sometimes having attacks on their persons. But here you see, this is one of their interviewees, and this is when she realizes that all the weird voicemails that her phone has been completely full of are actually men masturbating over the phone. And you get this sort of visual component to it, so it's not just a woman looking at her phone, you're also faced with what that kind of feels like for her. And similarly, this is a Sami woman who was harassed a lot online, and you see how that kind of harassment actually has this feeling, right? This is more about putting you in that sense of the feeling rather than documenting exactly what happened. As Viku says, the subject is dark, frightening, even overpowering. The cartoon makes it more accessible. Through pictures, you can tell different things than just text. And you can tell things that also require imagination. So Augusto Mora, who's one of a new movement of Mexican comics journalists, along with people like Eduardo Alba, he has been developing documentary comics in Mexico, and his work, Adonde Nos Llevan, specifically blends documentation and imagined moments of the kidnapping of the 43 Ayotzinapa teachers in Guadalajara. In conjunction with the research and interviewing that Mora carried out, he also used information obtained from novelistas in the student movement in order to depict moments in the lives of the disappeared that will never otherwise be recovered. As Mora states in his work, the point is that graphic narrative has elements that perhaps photography or documentary movies do not. With cartoons, one can capture moments that escape the camera. Just as new journalism stressed the importance of creating a scene, immersing a reader in the situation, work like Mora's confronts a reader with the truth of an event, which, even if it cannot be supported with photographic documentation, plays an essential role in the reporting of that event. Sacco similarly was sent by Details magazine, its art director Art Spiegelman, to report back from the War Crime Tribunal at The Hague when they were actually talking about the massacre in Srebrenica. So in this section from Joe Sacco's report, Sacco draws what can never be visually recorded. There's no photograph from the massacre that occurred in Srebrenica. As Lisa Parks has written, she's a media theorist, the only sort of photographic testimony we have that Srebrenica, this greatest massacre in recent times on European soil, even occurred, are these satellite photos, which were eventually the basis of NATO involvement in the war, but which you can see are just very grainy, and it's hard to see what disturbed Earth even means. It requires a lot of more interpretation, in my view. Even if it is not real photographic evidence, Sacco's account ethically renders the dead, and it puts the reader into their position, rather than that of a God's eye view from above. Finally, Patrick Chapat, a Lebanese-Swiss cartoonist and comics journalist, created a series for the New York Times called Inside Death Row, again going where very few can, Chapat and his wife, Anne Frederique Whitman, interviewed death row inmates as a form of graphic reportage. This powerful series brought the stories of so many otherwise disenfranchised and silent men to the readers of the paper of record. Problematically, but not without precedent, while Chapat and Whitman consider this series to be journalism, the New York Times filed it as opinion, again reviving questions about the veracity of drawing. This discrepancy immediately recalls the Times' decision to list Art Spiegelman's Mouse on its fiction bestsellers list. That decision led Spiegelman to send the following letter to the editor. So as you can see, he says, as an author, I could gracefully accept the compliment as intended, but to the extent that fiction indicates that a work isn't factual, I feel a bit queasy. As an author, I believe I might have lopped several years off the 13 I devoted to my 2-volume project if I could only have taken a novelist license while searching for a novelistic structure. The borderland between fiction and nonfiction has been fertile territory for some of the most potent contemporary writing. It's just that I shudder to think how David Duke, if he could read, would respond to seeing a carefully researched work based closely on my father's memories of life in Hitler's Europe and in the death camps, classified as fiction. This letter ultimately led to the Times moving his book from fiction bestsellers to nonfiction, but not without debate. This ambiguity between truth and reality is ultimately the most significant way in which comics journalism can intervene in journalism itself, forcing readers to reckon with the question of how we visually assess what is real and what is true. Comics journalists ask us to question whether these categories are always one and the same. In our contemporary moment, when the Columbia Journalism Review recently reported that trust in the press in the U.S. is at its all-time lowest, what might comics offer for journalism and reportage? How might the form of witnessing in comics journalism speak to not only a new genre of narrative art, but a new ethic of journalism? To return to Butler's concept of framing the frames, comics journalism forces a reader to grapple with questions of truth and reality. As comics artist Didier Cassai describes, comics also tell a story, allowing us to know what is happening in another world, a different world. The ethic of comics journalism extends beyond merely informing a reader to forcing a reader to confront another subjectivity and to seriously consider how the information that they received is framed and framed for a purpose. Comics scholar Hilary Shute specifically credits comics reportage with inviting one to look while signaling the difficulty of looking. But as Goya reminds us, if they cannot look, we must. We become the participant in comics journalism as not only an accurate form of witnessing, but an ethical one. It is finally in this consideration that comics journalism compels us, in the words of Susan Sontag, to set aside the sympathy we extend to others beset by war and murderous politics for a reflection on how our privileges are located on the same map as their suffering and may, in ways we may prefer not to imagine, be linked to their suffering, as the wealth of some may imply the destitution of others. In the era of fake news and the erosion of the fourth estate, comics journalism presents an ethical vehicle in the pursuit of ever-tenuous truth.
Yes. How much of these are actually being printed and how much are online?
No, that's a really fantastic question that I think is important. If we go back to new journalism, right? Tom Wolfe talks about how much it has to do with literary journalism. journalism that's more like a book. Bless you. And I think that we can see comics journalism also arriving with literary comics, like graphic novels. And so someone like Joe Sacco is really generally producing a lot of book-length work. Sarah Glidden's work, that beautiful watercolor reportage, that's all book work. But most of the other ones that I've shown, most of these are actually being done online because a lot of them, frankly, can't get book contracts, don't have enough material, don't have access to those sorts of channels of publishing. So it is also, I think, kind of slightly more democratic in that way as well, that you have a lot of people working in both formats. It's a great, yeah.
So I'm so ignorant, I thought I was going to something about political cartoons. So how are
That's tomorrow.
So how do people find these? How would they, you don't get them in a newspaper or in a magazine, where do you get them?
So it's actually interesting. Chapat, whose work I was showing, he was the New York Times political cartoonist. And the New York Times recently decided to stop publishing all political cartoons in first the International Times and then also the New York Times online due to not Chapat's work but an unfavorable depiction of Sharon. So a lot of these people, like Chapat's work was being featured in the New York Times, it sometimes still is, but a lot of these can be found in bookstores as well. All of Sacco's books are available, in fact, here, the Eugene Public Library, and over at
Third floor, right next to the reference desk.
yeah. So you have, if you're looking for a book, they're pretty findable. If you're looking just for comics, there's actually a lot of really wonderful outlets online now. In addition to Cartoon Movement, there's the Nib, which is all political cartoons and comics journalism. There's a French journalism, long-form journalism platform called 21, and they have a lot of comics journalism on the site. There is still the remnant of Symbolia, which was the New York Times attempt to do comics journalism as a dedicated thing. And there's also a really, in addition to Cartoon Movement, there's another Dutch comics journalism site. So if you want to do comics journalism, my advice, be Dutch or get there. Because there's another one called Drawing the Times. It's really, really beautiful coming out of the Times. So it is findable, but I agree that it's not something, hopefully this talk helps to spread the word that it exists and is important. Yes?
With the advent of the ownership by corporations of print media and just in general of journalism, reporters now really do not report exactly what's going on. And when you were talking about objectivity, there really is in some way no objectivity because you're given your choice of words. It makes things subjective. So 2 questions. How has that, if at all, with the ownership by corporations of journalistic mediums, how has that affected the journalistic comics? And looking at Europe and going back to the use of puppetry in Europe, when we always see puppetry as very childlike, but they use puppetry as a way to comment. Does Europe view the journalistic comics differently than here? And I don't know how much. I know what's his name, Rudolph. He owns a lot of stuff in Britain and so on. But has that had an impact in Europe as well? The ownership.
The multinational corporate ownership of so many news outlets and media, I mean, absolutely, that it affects all of the news that we can possibly read. I will say Joe Sacco still reads The Guardian, which is coming out of Britain, and really that's about it. There's a couple other outlets he still feels that he trusts, but not many, and none in the U.S. for the most part. So I think you're right to pinpoint that kind of mistrust of the corporate structure of Fox News 24-hour news system inspires a lot of the journalists who are currently working in comics journalism. What I think then is interesting and perhaps counterintuitive is that really a lot of European comics journalists, and there are a lot of them, and there are also comics journalists now. There's actually a huge manga comics journalism channel that's happening in Japan that I don't know enough about to speak to today. But many of those people cite Joe Sacco as the reason that they got into comics journalism. So I think there's a really fun sort of back and forth that's happening in terms of trying to think of creative ways to present documentation and documentary reporting that's outside of those corporate channels. And Sacco works for a number of British publications. He's been published in The Guardian. That's probably why he reads it, but that's cynical. And he's also been published in Take On, and a lot of people have gone back and forth in terms of that transaction. But I think that's, you're absolutely right that this question of corporate control is driving a lot of this work as well. Yes.
Is anyone still publishing corporate crime comics or comic books like that in underground comics?
Yeah, so there are not corporate crime comics exactly, because Leonard Grievous, he's not doing that right now. But there are definitely similar sorts of publications like World War III, I would say, is, if that's what you're looking for, I can a few of those. And those, that's a part of the talk that I had 4 hours, we would have for sure gotten into. People like Grievous also thinking about, there was an entire collaboration by a bunch of comics artists and the Christic Institute to publish this thing called Brought to Light, which is basically their documents in comics form. So yeah, there's definitely more to this story, and I wish that we had time to get into all of that as well. Yes. Yes, you pointing at yourself.
Just curious, a clarification, were you saying that you don't consider political or editorial cartoons subsumed under comic journalism?
I think a lot of people who do comics journalism also do political cartoons, and it's not a hill I care enough about to die or not die on as to whether single panel cartoons are or aren't comics. But I do think that there's sort of a difference in kind of the long form reporting that many of these people are doing, which requires a lot of going back to sources, interviewing sources. There's a slight distinction between that and, say, Joe Sacco or Patrick Chapat's political cartoons, which are equally invested in these sorts of questions in the news. I mean, certainly a lot of people felt that what Thomas Nast was doing was showing you the news of the day from Tammany Hall in a way that you couldn't get any other way. So I don't think there's necessarily a difference in, say, motivation or exigence, but just a difference in execution and process.
Gotcha. And part of my reason for asking is because it seems to me that unlike the forms that you've been displaying up here, editorial cartoons do actually are not slow. They in fact ride the 24-hour news cycle oftentimes, so they're very different in that respect.
Yeah, and I think not only that, they can be just as impactful if we think about events like, Charlie Hebdo, and thinking about how editorial cartoons can often create just as much outcry and panic as, prose news journalism. But I do think that there's a slight distinction there again in terms of process and the way that this kind of reporting is really invested in a process, an ethical process.
It seems more like a TV documentary as opposed to a TV news show.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair way to go about it. Some of these artists call themselves documentary comics artists. Some of them call themselves graphic reporters. So there's lots of different frames of terminology there. Yes.
Well, one quote of Goya's is art is not what you see, but what you must make others see. And I'd like to get a comment on the whole zine movement. I know that's the smaller way of getting published.
I mean, I think that,
You might not know what a zine is. Short for magazine, but it's self-published, should be Xerox.
yeah, and I think that definitely it's still an important part of comics development. And if you think about certain figures like Andy Warner, their works were originally done as zines, and they were brought to different forms and different forms in which they could be circulated in that format. The thing, when we went back to thinking about whether these are getting published or whether they're online, that's something where the zine often intervenes as this sort of form of print that is much more democratic and that allows for access to publication channels. I think that it doesn't allow for quite the same amount of saturation that a lot of these artists do now on the internet, but it's definitely still an important part of comics history as well. Yes?
So on that same thing, so if you're doing like superhero comics and you want to get into superhero comics, you don't immediately have to write All-Star Superman or some great graphic novel. You can just do the crappy made-for-kids version of Guardians of the Galaxy that Marvel throws you on first so you can climb up. So what's that sort of intervening state between I'm doing maybe some political cartoons to I take 3 years to write a beautiful book?
So there's two answers to that question, I would say. First of all, there's a lot of programs, and this is not to try and push anyone away from our wonderful programs, which are wonderful. But at Stanford, in fact, Andy Warner is the art director for the Stanford Graphic Novel Project, which is a year-long project where they bring in tons of students and they document and report on a nonfiction event through comics. And they learn how to do this project over the course of the entire semester, 2 semesters, and they learn the skills that are needed. You're basically producing like whole classes full of potential comics journalists through this process itself. But the NIB, which I really do recommend you start reading. It's free, it's online, it's great if you're into political cartoons or comics journalism. It's got both.
NIV.
It's, yeah, NIV.
Portland-based.
Yes, it's Portland-based. Matt Bors, who had his own graphic reportage coming out. I actually have a picture of him coming out of Afghanistan. They do really amazing team-ups where you'll have a newer artist. These are all the things I wanted to get to, but couldn't. This is Matt Bors. They'll have a newer artist who's never, say, done comics drawing or comics journalism before be teamed with someone who has. And that also allows for a lot of people who are especially not familiar with, say, platforms like digital comics to learn with someone who can really guide them and show them how to do that. So I'd say those are my answers, both pre-professionally and professionally, of ways that you could think of getting into comics journalism. But again, you will never make a lot of money at it. I'm sorry. Like,
Unless someone buys the film rights.
exactly. But at that point, it's old news.
So I'd like to leave a little time, so if any of you want to come up and talk to Katherine, we have that time available. Katherine, thank you so much for coming tonight.